Good evening. Venerable Children is currently traveling and teaching in Southern California and returns on Monday. So tonight we're going to discuss some of the review questions that she left with us to help us reflect further on Nagarjuna's teachings. So let's start with our motivation. So as we know, from a Buddhist point of view, it's our motivation that determines whether an action becomes beneficial or not, positive or not. So if we reflect for a moment, what is it that makes all the troubles in our life, in our world? Sadly, it's our own destructive emotions. And so throughout the day, our mind is disturbed by various afflictions, attachment, anger, jealousy, pride, self-grasping, and supported by self-cherishing. And so with mindfulness and introspective awareness, we try to notice when they arise and apply the antidotes right away. And so for attachment, we can think about impermanence or the ugliness of the object. With anger, we can meditate on love or the disadvantages of anger. With confusion, we can meditate on the law of cause and effect. And so these antidotes do indeed temporarily suppress the destructive emotions, at least for a short while. But applying the antidotes is a full-time job for most of us. And so wouldn't it be more productive to address the root of these destructive emotions? Because all the afflictions are based on the ignorance that grasps at inherent existence. And so practices that teach us to overcome that ignorance then undermine all of the destructive emotions. This is the extraordinary gift of insight. And just as we want to be free of suffering, want to experience nothing but happiness, convenience, all good things coming our way, the same is true of all sentient beings. So tonight, let's motivate strongly that we can develop our wisdom and insight by reflecting on these questions on emptiness so that we can be of greater and greater benefit to all living beings. So I'd like to begin by saying that very little of what I've prepared for tonight is original. It's all come from other people. So to avoid plagiarism, being accused of plagiarism, I'll just say that most of it came from Geshe Jampa Tekchok or His Holiness or Venerable Children. So last week, Venerable covered verses through verses 322. However, in our review questions, we're still back on chapter 1, the causes of higher rebirth and higher good, liberation and enlightenment. And so tonight, my hope is that we can cover questions 8, 9, and 10 from quiz 4. And this takes us all the way back to verse 80. So we have to dig deep into our notes to find some of the information that we may have heard. And it's interesting to keep in mind that all the Buddha's teachings are for the purpose of leading us gradually to the realization of emptiness. So even though thinking about emptiness may seem difficult at first or even after we've been studying for a while, but it's a very worthwhile use of our time, isn't it? Because as I noted in the motivation, it undermines all the afflictions. And so if you're just joining us and you have not heard the earlier teachings, then please take some time to listen to Venerable's teachings from last fall. You'll find them on her website, tuptenchodron.org, and there's a little section on the left that says Browse All Categories. And if you click on that, then you'll see Dependent Arising and Emptiness, and if you click on that, you'll see Precious Garland on Thursday nights. And so verse 80 was covered in September 24th, also October 1st and October 8th. So she spent quite a bit of time on this verse. And I think, I'm not sure, maybe we covered part of it already. Her teachings on this were very clear, so please have a look there to supplement our discussion tonight. Okay, so I thought it might be helpful, since it's been a while since we've looked at that verse, just to think about the context that Nagarjuna was bringing this verse up. And so, just before verse 80, Nagarjuna was explaining how all phenomena exist as being merely fabricated or merely labeled by thought. And he was addressing specifically the most subtle level of dependent arising. And so just as that's true of phenomena, it's also true of the self, that the self is merely imputed in dependence upon its basis of designation. So we might just reflect for a moment, how does the mind engage the self? Or, how does the mind engage the self? When we think I, how does the mind engage the self? They say that, first of all, the physical and or the mental aggregates will appear to the mind. And when they appear to the mind, they appear as if they're truly existent. So although the mind is mistaken with respect to that appearance of true existence, the mind that notices that can still be a conventionally valid mind. But then in the next moment, without even, it's innate, right? So without even thinking, really, the mind grasps onto those aggregates as if they're truly existent. And then based on that, the self or the I appears to the mind. The I also appears as if it's truly existent. And again, at first, in that split second, it's not even a second, it's like a millisecond, that I appearing, even though it appears truly existent, sure, the mind is mistaken with that appearance, but that mind can be a valid conventional mind. There's the I. There is an I that exists conventionally, right? But again, in the next millisecond, then usually, especially if there's any kind of affliction in the mind, then there's a grasping at that I, and we're often running. We're involved in the innate grasping at the self, and that's the root of cyclic existence. So it's good to come to a conclusion that there's nothing within the aggregates that is inherently the I or the self. As we'll see tonight, one aggregate is not the I. The collection of the 5 aggregates or the 6 constituents is not the I. No part of the aggregates or the constituents, the elements, is the I. And even the continuity of the aggregates is not the real I. Furthermore, if we search outside the aggregates, we can't identify anything that is I or me separate from the aggregates. So nowhere is there a real I to be found. Nothing can be posited or identified as being the real I. So the I is merely designated by conception, fabricated by thought, independence on the aggregates. But just because the real I or the self isn't found, does that mean that the I doesn't exist? No. So how do we know that? Because we're sitting here. Because the I is related to the aggregates. There's no I without aggregates. And so the I exists because there's no I without the aggregates. Is that? I was just repeating what you said. Okay, any other ideas? It functions, the I functions, yeah. That's really the basis of the middle way, or that's like the fundamental aspect of the middle way, is that even within the absence of an atom of inherent existence, things still function. That's right. Okay, it functions. Maybe a more bookish answer is that the I fulfills the criteria of an existent. So if we are trying to rely on some logic and reasoning, this is a good one to hang on to. The I fulfills the criteria, the 3 criteria for conventional existence. So first of all, the person is commonly known in the world. I'm commonly known in the world, you're commonly known in the world. People know us. We're commonly known. That's the first one. We all know that the person exists. We're sitting here, we're listening, we perform actions, like you say, we function. That's the first one. Then secondly, the existence of the I isn't contradicted by any conventional, reliable cognizer or valid cognizer. So other people whose senses are unimpaired, they look at us, they see a person, they see the person functioning. And then the third criteria is that the existence of the I isn't contradicted by a rational awareness or a probing awareness analyzing the ultimate nature. So while that rational analysis analyzing the ultimate can negate the existence of an inherently existent person, or I, it can't negate the existence of a conventionally existent I. That's not its job. That's outside of its purview. Okay. All right. So that brings us to question 8. Question 8 says, why do you think Nagarjuna emphasized that the person is not the body, the 5 elements, when the lower tenet systems grasp the mind, or one type of mind, as the person? So this is referring to verse 80, and I was just remembering when His Holiness taught on Precious Garland in Seattle last year, not Seattle, Brisbane, wrong country. He asked us to memorize verse 80 and 81. And I also noticed that on his birthday this year, in one of his addresses, he asked people as a birthday present to meditate on dependent arising and emptiness. So this is a good way to do that. So it's nice to print these 2 verses out that we'll be looking at tonight and either commit them to memory or at least read them each day and think about what they're trying to convey. So verse 80 says, a person is not earth, not water, not fire, not wind, not space, not consciousness, not all of them. What person is there other than these? All right, so the question is, why do you think Nagarjuna emphasized that the person is not the body, the 5 elements, when the lower tenet systems grasp the mind, or one type of the mind, as the person? So let's begin with your answers. How did you respond to this? Any clear ideas coming to the fore? Yeah.
Seems to me that he's setting us up and leading us into looking at the selflessness of phenomena even as we look at selflessness.
That's an interesting thing to bring up, that he's leading us into investigating selflessness of phenomena first, and then selflessness of person after that. Okay, there's evidence for that, isn't there? I think it was verse 35, when as long as one conceives of the aggregates, one will conceive of an I, something like that. Okay, so let's hold on to that and maybe come back to that. Anything else come to your mind? Yes.
Actually, I came to the same conclusion as Venerable Truly after thinking about this for a long time.
Uh-huh.
Maybe because of how 80 links to 81, I guess.
Uh-huh.
Because, the lower schools don't assert a selflessness of phenomena, but they would agree that that the form is made out of part. Right? That they can agree on.
Mm-hmm.
From there, he's leading them to see if a person's made of parts and not real, those parts are also made of parts and not real, like that.
Okay. All right, so Venerable Damcha is supporting Venerable Chuni's assertion. Anything else? It may not even be too tricky. I mean, the challenge here is that we don't have correct answers given to us, so it's not like we can look ahead and cheat, Any other ideas? Okay, well, I'll tell you my thinking. I had 2 thoughts. One was along the lines of Venerable Chuni and Damcha. But first of all, I thought the middle way consequence school explains the illustration of the person to be the mere I. Right? They don't assert anything that's found within the 5 aggregates, within the elements, within the constituents. They assert a mere I that's merely labeled independence upon whatever basis of designation you choose to look at. And that's different from the lower tenet schools, who all posit something from within the basis of designation, like one of the aggregates, even one of the constituents, because consciousness is one of the constituents. Or even if we're just talking about the body and the mind, they would say, well, the mind is the person. So in verse 80, when Nagarjuna states that the person is not, in that verse he actually states that the person is not consciousness. That's a direct contradiction to a lot of other philosophical assertions. even if those schools were not clearly delineated at that time. I'm not sure if they were or not. But there would have been people who personally held those kind of tenets because the Buddha taught various things to various people. Okay. So he clearly doesn't agree with those lower schools' assertions that an illustration of the person is the mind or one type of the mind, like maybe the mind basis of all, or the subtle consciousness. So why is that the case? Yeah, why is it that the mind or one type of the mind is not an illustration of the person? Why would he refute that? Because through ultimate analysis you can't find it. Yes, that's true. There might be another roundabout, or there might be another way of saying that very thing. Stephen? The mind doesn't function as a person. Really? What about not in this moment, but what about in that moment between death and the bardo? You know, that last moment of, when the subtle fundamental mind arises at the time of death. Really, there's only a subtle mind there. And even through the bardo, yes, you have a subtle body, but for all intents and purposes, that's a mind that's going through those experiences. Or the formless realm, right? Yeah. What is the definition of a person? Yeah. All the schools would agree that a person, anybody have it? A person? Person is a being imputed independence upon 4 or 5 aggregates is usually how the lower schools say it. Often you hear it also said the being imputed independence upon any of the 5 aggregates. So even just one. Well, but if you have the consciousness, you're going to have feeling, discrimination, and at least some things within compositional factors, aren't you? So you would have more than one aggregate there. You'd have 4 aggregates. Yeah.
It can't be the inherently existent I because it's not inherently existent, it's changing.
Okay, so it can't be the inherently existent I. Are you assuming that the mind is inherently existent, or why do you say that?
Because the mind is dependent and changing.
Mm-hmm.
Something that's inherently existent to be independent.
Yeah.
And thus not changing also.
Okay. So how does that relate back to Nagarjuna not agreeing with the lower schools? I mean, what's the problem with saying that the mind is found within, or that the illustration of the person is found within the basis of designation of the person? Actually, it comes back to what Venerable Jigme said. If the I was the illustration, if the mind was the illustration of the person, and you could actually find it within the basis of designation, you have found inherent existence. Yeah. Does that make sense? There is a basis of designation, and there's a mind that labels, oh, this is the I. It's so much easier when we talk about a chariot, or a cart, or a car. And I think that's one of the reasons that we are encouraged to look at those things first, and then we can apply that to the self, which is a little bit easier than applying that to our own aggregates. Okay. So the labeled phenomena, the self, the I, and its basis of designation are one entity, but distinct. They're one entity because they're seen by a reliable cognizer, and they're not seen as separate. Both are seen by a reliable cognizer, and they're not seen as separate. They're distinct because they're distinct in name, they're distinct in meaning. One is the basis for the other. So we're going to talk about that later because that comes into play with question number 10. So when you see the aggregates, you see the person. When you see the person, you see the aggregates. They're one entity. But if the subtle mental consciousness is the person, it can't be the basis of designation for the person then, because it is the person. It's the labeled phenomena. And like I said, if that person is found within the basis of designation, then the person would inherently exist or truly exist. So Nagarjuna does not agree with the lower schools that the mind or a type of the mind is the person. So in verse 80, then Nagarjuna is leading us to examine how we try to find the real person. If we think we can identify I or me, then we need to try to locate it. And as Venerable led you, I wasn't here yet, but when she led you back in September and October, she said, you know, it sure seems as if we're sitting here where the body and the mind are located. And it sure seems as if that I truly exists. So if the I truly exists, then we should be able to locate it. And so we begin examining. Now, more commonly than the elements, like Nagarjuna is identifying, we talk about the person being imputed independence upon the aggregates. We could just as easily say the person is imputed independence upon those constituents, but we don't really relate to constituents very much. Maybe as a Westerner, instead of talking about elements, it's easier to look in terms of the parts of the body, because really that's what the aggregates are, or the elements are. So we could divide the body up in terms of the head, the torso, the arms, the legs. That's one way of doing it. Another way that, I'm not sure where I came up with this, but or where I learned this from, but I find it very effective to examine in terms of, is the eye the skin, or the flesh, or the bones, or the organs, any of the organs, or the consciousness, any of the individual consciousnesses, any of the individual moments of consciousness. Just a side comment on the elements, because it's interesting. I think it's interesting. I looked it up on the internet, and Wikipedia says this. Take it for what it's worth. Classical elements typically refer to the pre-scientific concepts in India and ancient Greece of earth, water, fire, air, and ether, which were proposed to explain the nature and complexity of all matter in terms of simpler substances. Ancient cultures in Egypt, Babylonia, Japan, Tibet, and India had similar lists, sometimes referring in local languages to air as wind and the fifth element as the void. The Chinese system was slightly different, including wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. They boldly went on to say, centuries of empirical investigation have proven that all the ancient systems were incorrect explanations of the physical world. It is now known that the atomic theory is the correct explanation. Doesn't it make you wonder why Chinese medicine works, or or Tibetan medicine, or Ayurveda? Yeah. So there's something to it. But perhaps, just different doors into looking at things. Also in Dan Perdue's book, Debate, he says, the four elements serve as the principal elements or bases for all material phenomena. Matter, which is not one of the four elements, is arisen from the elements. Yet the elements do not occur in strictly irreducible units. Rather, they can exist as potencies within physical particles, the atoms which compose all internal and external matter. So atom might be an introduction by a Western translator, but we could use the word particle. They did talk about, at least that's how it's been translated, they talked about some small unit, which most often is translated as particle. So each atom or particle is an aggregate of at least 8 components. Have you come across this before? Earth, water, fire, and wind. Also, visible form, odor, taste, and tangibility. I forget, there's a reason why sound is not included. Do you remember? I couldn't find it. Sutra also would agree with that. No. The sound is emitted for a particular reason. Even the Sutra school would accept that. For elements, or? Well, every atom or every particle is going to be made up of the 4 elements plus these 4 things like form, sound, form, smell, taste, and touch. And one will be predominant and give, the stronger characteristic. So like for instance, water is wet and moist, but it has this cohesiveness. So even in a grain of sand, there will be earth, water, fire, air, and these other elements as well, or these other aspects. They're called evolutes of the elements. But like if you're talking about wet sand, there's this strong cohesiveness to the sand. That's from the water element, even though the other aspects are there as well. So this is a very early way, an ancient way, let's say, of describing the smallest particles that exist. Okay. If you want to read more about that, that's on page 211, starting on 211 in Dan's book, Debate. So these kinds of descriptions come from the study of Dura, or collected topics, and that's the most introductory text used in the Galupa system for training in reasoning and debate. And so it provides a description of the various topics to be debated, like how things exist, established bases, colors, isolates, things like that. And so Dr. Perdue says that by developing a path of reasoning, one knows without hesitation or indecision the implications of both their and other assertions, and can draw out implications and possible interpretations of what has been said. So by understanding a worldview about what exists, they're describing the basis, like colors, shapes, form. Well, all selfless is the largest category, right? And then permanent, impermanent, permanent things. Impermanent things are further divided into form, consciousness. What's Venerable's term? Non-associated composites. Abstract composites. And even those are further divided. And so then, like, form would be divided further into form source, sound source, smell source, taste source, tactile source. Okay, and so it's within, the reason I'm bringing this up is because the definition of tactile source is that which is experienced by the body consciousness. And that's what's further divided into tactile objects such as the elements. It's a tactile object of the tactile. It's a tactile source that's known by the body consciousness. Okay, so the definition of earth is that which is hard and solid. It manifests as stability. It's the predominance of stability. Water is wet and moist, and you find these definitions throughout a lot of what we read, what we study. So it's good to understand them. Although the definition of water is that which is wet and moist, it manifests its cohesiveness. And I think wet sand was a really good example of that. The definition of fire is that which is hot and burning, manifests as warmth or heat. Definition of wind is that which is light and moving, and manifests as motility or movement. Even within the body, the fact that blood moves up and down the body is due to the winds, or the mind moves riding on the winds. Okay, and then space just refers to the open spaces in the body, and it's non-material. So, although it's lumped in here with the elements, technically it's not an element according to Dura, or collected topics. Okay, there's also a nice section on meditation on emptiness on that. So that's just a little bit of a side data. Okay. So Lama Tsongkhapa also quotes this verse 80 in his commentary on the Root of Wisdom. His commentary was called Illumination of the Thought. He said, "A person is not earth, water, fire, wind, or space, not consciousness." In other words, that refutes positing the parts as a person. So we're refuting the parts being the labeled phenomena, the person. And not all of them. That phrase refutes positing the collection of the constituents as a person. So even the collection is not the person. What person is there other than these? That line refutes positing something that is a different entity from the constituents as the person. So verse 80 is getting us to investigate how the I exists. And actually, what it's leading us to is to examine if the I exists as it appears, inherently existent, truly existent, then it has to be either inherently one with its basis of designation, those elements or those constituents, those aggregates, or inherently separate from those parts. And so that's what we're going to look at in question 10. We'll come to that. So if we're not any of the individual parts and we're not the collection of the parts, well, where is the findable person? $64 million question. Okay. Verse 81 says, just as the person is not real due to being a composite of 6 constituents, so each constituent also is not real due to being a composite. So just as the person does not inherently exist because it's merely imputed on the aggregates, the constituents, or the parts, each of the parts also does not inherently exist because it exists independence upon its parts. So this is the beauty, this is the subtlety of the middle way consequence point of view, isn't it? That there's no inherent basis, there's no findable basis. That is, it's like an infinite regress. The more we look into the next level of basis, that basis also is merely imputed on its basis of designation, and so on and so on and so on. So we can think about this in terms of like the skin. The skin is merely labeled on different layers of cells, isn't it? There's the epidermis, there's the dermis, and then there's the subcutaneous dermis, or the dermis underneath, the hypodermis. There we go. So it's interesting to think about. You know, we identify so strongly with how we look, our skin. You know, think about if we had our skin peeled off, well, we'd look very different, wouldn't we? So to investigate, well, what is this skin that I so strongly look in the mirror at every day and identify with? There's me. And then to even investigate, okay, there's an outer layer, this is the epidermis, but you know, that's made up of water molecules and lipids and proteins and fats and chemicals, all sorts of other things. So to keep investigating and try to get to the most subtle part, even those molecules and those cells would also have their parts. Eventually we'd get to the level of atoms, so we could use what we understand, the correct theory of how things exist. We want to be correct. To imagine that even at the most subtle level, even the water molecules, for instance, in our body are made up of hydrogen and oxygen, and 2 hydrogens and an oxygen, and each of those are made up of a nucleus and lots of neutrons and protons and electrons. And even those, they're finding more and more subtle parts. So I think it's fascinating to really think about how in ourselves, as well as all, you know, things that seem hard and solid, there's more space there than anything. I've heard a number of people mention that the Buddha was the first quantum physicist. You know, he was ahead of his time in how things existed. Okay. So just a little bit more, because that question, I don't know, I didn't come back around to verse 35, but if we think about when we investigate how the, okay, first of all, when we grasp at a person, what is it we see first? We see the body, we see the form aggregate. And so that's phenomena, isn't it? So we see the self of phenomena first, and then we impute an I, and we get the self of person. But when we realize emptiness, we go the opposite direction, right? We realize the selflessness of person first, and then, because that's considered easier to understand, isn't that amazing? But is that really the case? We can look at that from 2 points of view. One is, I think it's very difficult to meditate on the emptiness of the self, because that requires that we understand the aggregates, and it's difficult to understand the mind. The mind is not something we can, like a computer we can take apart, we can look at its parts, or a chariot we can take apart and look at its parts. But the person, I mean, we could talk about a corpse and we can talk about a mind that goes to another life, but we can't see that, and so it becomes much more difficult. So we can talk about things like the chariot and understand how the chariot exists independence upon its parts by taking it apart mentally or physically and seeing how it's merely imputed on a functioning collection of those parts. And that can be a basis then for investigating the self, because we can understand the parts of the self, at least the body and the mind at that level. We understand that we're made up of those 2 parts. We can even look at the parts of the body. And then and also there's a clue right in this definition of person. If the person is merely imputed independence upon the aggregates, well, it's telling us right there it's imputed. It's imputed independence upon the aggregates. That's the clue. It doesn't exist inherently or independent of the aggregates. It's imputed. So we can use that to our advantage to understand how the self is easier to realize. The selflessness of person is easier to realize than selflessness of phenomena. So we can go in this progression. Selflessness of phenomena, of things that even if we realize them, they're not going to cut our root of existence, cyclic existence, like the chariot. But we can utilize that understanding to then examine the self, a person, or the person, and then once we understand the emptiness of the person, we can apply that to even more that more subtle aspect of ourselves. Like, are you sure I'm not the mind? Like, who is it that's making decisions? You know, all those questions come up. Also, really what verse 35 was getting at is that you can't realize selflessness of person if you're still grasping at self of phenomena. Right, and so even though you don't realize selflessness of phenomena first, you can at least cut the grasping by having an intellectual understanding. And then because you've at least challenged that intellectual understanding, then you can go on to realize selflessness of person. Yeah. Okay. Enough on that question? Anything else?
Just to kind of refresh maybe, so the lower tenet systems don't, they say that the mind is the person, so what is their relationship to the aggregates? How do they justify what they...
The aggregates truly exist for them. Yeah, especially Great Exposition and Sutra School, they assert a self of phenomena. They say that established vases truly exist. And so, but if we think about what is it the lower schools are asserting, Great Exposition asserts like the continuum of the aggregates. There are lots of sub-schools, right, lots of sub-schools within the Great Exposition, but yeah, the continuum of the aggregates, the collection of the aggregates. Then I think Sutra School says the continuum of the aggregates or the primary mental consciousness. Then Mind Only says mind basis of all. Yep. Then once we get to middle way autonomy, both schools would assert subtle mental consciousness and then the mere I. And even though the basis of designation of the mere I is the subtle primary mental consciousness, still they want to avoid that unwanted consequence of finding the self within the aggregate, so they're going to say it's just the mere I, designated independence upon the primary consciousness. So that way, the primary mental consciousness continues or maintains its identity as the basis of designation. The mere I is merely imputed on that. Yeah. So you see this progression of coarse to more subtle. Yeah. Okay. So let's go on to number 9. What does it mean to say there are two selves, one that exists and the other that doesn't?
There's a conventional self that does exist, and an inherently existing self that does not exist at all.
Right. So there's a conventional self that does exist, and there's an inherently existent self that doesn't exist, never has existed, never will exist. And yet it runs our life, doesn't it? Or grasping at it runs our life, let's put it that way. Okay, so the self that exists is the person who creates karma, experiences pleasure and pain, and neutrality. So again, from the middle way consequence point of view, this is the mere I that exists by being merely designated by conception. It doesn't mean that the I is a mere name, but it exists, or it is established. I like that word. It's established. How is it established? By being merely imputed. It does exist. But how does it come into being? Maybe that's another way of thinking about it. How is it established as an object of knowledge? By being imputed, merely imputed. So I think many of you have studied a bit of mind and awareness and the 7 types of awareness. I think it's really helpful to think of in terms of, when we talk about consciousnesses, we talk about what's the focal object of that consciousness, and what's the aspect, or what's the, Venerable likes the word, what's the apprehended object. Sometimes you see what's the engaged object, or the object of the mode of apprehension. So if we think about self-grasping ignorance, what would be the focal object of that? What is it observing that it gets wrong? The self. That's right, that mere I, but we can just say the self that exists, the conventional self. Okay, and then how does it actually hold that self to exist? Right, so the aspect, or the apprehended object, or the object of the mode of apprehension, or the engaged object, the conceived object, there's so many names for this, is the inherently existent self. Okay, now let's just contrast that with wisdom realizing emptiness. What does it observe? I'm sorry, okay, that's right, but what's the focal object that it observes? That's what I meant to say. It has to focus on something that exists. That's what it finds. Yes, that's what it finds. But its focal object would be also the self. Yeah. Isn't it interesting? Wisdom realizing emptiness and self-grasping ignorance focus on the same thing. They have the same focal object, the self, the conventional self, the mere I. Self-grasping holds or apprehends that I to exist inherently, so the inherently existent self. Wisdom realizing emptiness, you might think it finds the conventional self, because the conventional self exists. But actually that's not correct, is it? So what does the wisdom realizing emptiness find? Finds the lack of inherent existent self, the emptiness of inherent existent self. You know, as a shortcut we can just say it finds emptiness. But it does have a referent. It has a basis for that emptiness. It finds the emptiness of the focal object.
So the apprehended object of the wisdom realizing emptiness is the lack of inherent existence of the self.
Yep. Or a self that lacks inherent existence. The self. The same one as wisdom realizing emptiness, self-grasping ignorance, both focus on the conventional self. We can just say the self.
So the mere I.
Yep, the mere I, the conventional self, the I, the person, the being. Those are all synonymous. They find very different things.
It's exactly why the one is the antidote to the other.
That's right. They are contradictory.
Contradictory to the same focal.
They're contradictory in their apprehension. They're contradictory in their mode of apprehending that focal object. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so, yeah.
That doesn't make sense to me that the focal object would be the conventionally existent I, and the conceived object would be the lack of an inherently existent I.
Why?
Because it seems like when you analyze, it would seem to me that the focal object would be an inherently existent I, and you wouldn't find it, so then your conceived object would be the lack of it.
Well, the focal object is different from the appearing object, if that helps. The focal object has to exist. It has to be an existent. And focal object is really difficult to pin down, evidently. You know, again, this is one of those topics where you can say, we asked the Geshis a number of times to explain it more clearly. But it's one thing I do know for sure is the focal object must exist. So it's focusing on something that exists. And it either apprehends it correctly or it misapprehends it. The appearing object, for which one? For which one? Don't confuse things.
apparent mind is the...
Just a minute, let me just finish here.
No, I was just responding to Stephen's thing about the inherently existent object, that a focal object must be, the object must be an existent.
Yep.
Then you said the appearing object doesn't have.
Well,
What's
okay, so the appearing object can be either the actual thing if you're talking about a sense consciousness, or it can be a generic image if you're talking about a conceptual consciousness. So if we're talking about self-grasping ignorance, that's a conception, isn't it? And depending for the wisdom realizing emptiness, it depends if it's a conceptual realization or a perceptual realization. You can have a mental consciousness that is perceiving, perceptually realizing, directly realizing the object.
Because I couldn't figure out how could it be a conceived object if we have used it.
Well, you wouldn't use, okay, that's a good point. So you wouldn't use conceived object for a perceptual realization or a perceptual realization of any kind, a sense consciousness or a mental consciousness, because at that point it's not conceived. Yep. So you'd say engaged object. Yeah, you're not getting at the object through the medium of a generic image. Yep.
focal objects have to exist,
Mm-hmm.
have to be in existence.
Yep.
What are these other appearing? I'm just trying to make it clear about what's mistaken and what's erroneous here.
Okay.
Like, remember we've been through this thing about the appearing object? Some say the blue snow mountain is the appearing object, and some of the teachings say the white snow mountain is the appearing object that appears as blue.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Not so
With a
clear.
mistaken consciousness or erroneous
Right.
consciousness.
Yep.
Okay.
Good.
Shake it down.
And with the conceptual cognizer, there is no appearing object, is there? You just call it the appearing object and the conceived object.
Well, no, appearing object can apply to conception or perception.
Is the generic image.
The way Venerable uses it, okay? It'd really be helpful if we knew the Tibetan. Because don't be confused, in Ladi Rinpoche's book, he equates appearing object with apprehended object. So if we're using it in terms of the aspect or the object of the mode of apprehension, then appearing object in that sense can refer to conception and perception. Okay, so sorry if we've lost some of you. These are helpful things to know, to really do a bit of study on different types of mind. Because our mind goes through different types of understanding about everything that we're studying in Dharma, and especially when we talk about this subject of emptiness, that you've heard this before. First, we have a wrong consciousness. We think things exist the way they appear. We think things exist inherently, independently. But then we might hear a teaching about emptiness, and then all of a sudden we have a doubt, like, they say that nothing exists inherently, that all things are merely imputed on a basis of designation. And so you have doubt tending away from the fact, equal doubt, doubt tending towards the fact. Slowly you're building up your understanding. You're creating a really, a clearer generic image in your own mind of how things exist or how they don't exist. And then eventually we will develop a correct assumption. And correct assumptions, we should really rejoice if we have a correct assumption. But we can't leave things at the level of correct assumption. That's often what happens. Is that we don't go further, we don't push it to developing a valid inference. So valid inference would be the next step, where you actually develop a mind that is incontrovertible with regard to its object. It's unshakable. And even though an inference is still getting at the understanding through the medium of a generic image, it's still incontrovertible. And then we can develop that, especially on something like emptiness, we can develop that to be a perceptual realization of, or a direct perception, a valid direct perception. I'm not sure what you call that. Valid perception? Oh. Yes. Yeah. Okay. It would be a yogic direct perception if you were realizing emptiness. Yep.
So, when you're talking about when we're meditating on emptiness, I have a line here, I think it's pretty verbatim out of one of the teachings.
Okay.
When meditating on emptiness, we don't look for an inherently existent person,
Right.
but rather we look for how the person
That's right. So we focus on something that does exist, and we examine to see. I mean, we can't focus on the inherently existent person because it's a non-existent.
Right.
Right. So we focus on something that does exist, and we imagine if it existed the way it appears. So first of all, we have to develop a doubt between how something appears and how it exists. And how we do that is by thinking about verse 80 and 81, that there's a basis for a designated label. And where was I going with that? Okay, so there's this discrepancy between how something exists. It exists as if it's independent, and it sure feels as if it's independent of any body or mind, especially when there's a strong emotion up. So then we investigate that discrepancy. If something did inherently exist, how would it exist? What would be the characteristics? And so by thinking about that, that's the first step, isn't it? Especially like in the 4-point analysis, you're trying to develop your understanding of what is the object of negation, really identifying that clearly. We're creating a strong generic image of if something inherently exists, it would be this way. Then you can begin to analyze the thing that does exist and see, is it? How does it actually exist? And when you find that it lacks that inherent existence, that's what you're finding. Not finding is the best finding. That's what you're finding, the lack of inherent existent person. You come to your conclusion. You have concluded that it doesn't exist that way, the way that it appears. Yep.
So getting back to the original question, what are the two persons? The two selves.
What does it mean to say there are two selves, one that exists and the other that doesn't?
I guess I would say that there are not two selves. There's one that exists, the other doesn't.
Touche.
But to say that they're two selves is kind of dangerous because they're actually correct and false way of looking at the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so you're bringing up an excellent point, and it's a little bit of a subtle point, and that is the first self that exists is the conventional self. It is the existent. The second self that doesn't exist is when we use that term self to mean inherent existence. That self doesn't exist.
But it's a misperception of the first self.
Yes, that's true. But there are these two uses of the word self. Like self of person is inherently existent person, or self of phenomena is inherently existent phenomena. That too, yeah. Yes, everything exists conventionally. Even emptiness exists conventionally, because emptiness exists. Yeah, and it is not harmed by those three types of analysis. Yes.
Could we say that second self, the inherently existent self, does appear to us?
Sure, the appearance exists.
Right. So in a way, that's the self we're cognizing now.
Yes, but an appearance is not a self, is it? It's an appearance of a self. Yeah.
But even conventional existence is very tenuous because it's only existed by neo-Labour.
You have been listening to Venerable very carefully. That's right. It's barely there. I love that. Yeah, it's merely imputed. What does merely imputed look like to a mind that understands that? I don't know. But you have an understanding when you see conventional phenomena, that they don't exist the way they appear.
Even after going to, okay, things don't inherently exist, but they exist conventionally.
Yes.
Yeah, rather than this mere, they exist merely, it's so, even, I want to make conventional reality still hard and fast.
Well, I would say that there's a middle ground, that you can talk about conventional things without going to grasping at them as inherently existent conventional things. So I think there's maybe a gradation here.
But when I hear by mere label, it wants to throw me right into Neil.
Uh-huh.
So that's what Alicia's saying is for me to get comfortable with the fact that even conventionalities are merely there. That I've got to get used to how that feels, how I experience
Yeah.
that, because
Mm-hmm.
So I never thought that I could throw myself into nihilism because I'm such a permanent absolutist, but that label, the more I think about it, the more I can see me leaning. What is it?
Uh-huh. Okay. Well, two things come to my mind. One is that we actually want to scare ourselves. We want to go, that means you're getting close. You know, you're getting closer. Okay, that's good. But if you do find that your mind easily veers into nihilism, then Lama Zopa Rinpoche suggests you go back to meditating on karma. Seriously, because it's so dangerous.
It doesn't fall easily, but the more I think about mere imputation,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm so clinging on to, inherent existence that I can see the thoughts coming up and say, well, then I've got to understand what mere imputation means.
Yeah. Yes. And, water bowls are a great opportunity to investigate this. So when you're making the offering, and you're thinking about there's no inherent person who's making this offering. I exist merely as imputed. There's no action. There's no inherent action of making this offering. There's individual moments of action and intention and all the rest. There's no inherent offering that's being made. It's also merely imputed. And then you investigate, how is this water merely imputed? Well, it's merely imputed on hydrogen and oxygen is a really good thing to investigate, Molecules, just molecules, and each of those molecules is just two hydrogens and H2, yeah, two hydrogens and an oxygen. And what are those? And, because we have been exposed to science, we can at least fantasize about electrons and neutrons and protons spinning around a nucleus, and I just find that really expansive for the mind, and even though it's just all at the level of fantasy, for me, still it brings some levity to the mind. Or thinking about the body and really expanding out the body, like just.
I think dependent arising is that's right. What you're talking about is just take the parts, get them down to the parts, and then I can loosen my mind up about throwing myself into nihilism. So dependent arising is a good thing, the angel I find on occasion on how to work with this.
As strongly as you understand karma, I can't imagine you ever falling into nihilism. So I think you're safe. You've heard enough teachings from Venerable.
But
Yeah.
this one moment tonight, I'm chewing on it a lot lately.
Uh-huh. Good.
That Venerable's been giving.
Yeah. Wonderful.
I used to say, how could anybody possibly be a nihilist? But there's a little bit having an understanding on how that can happen. Not
Yeah.
this one, but mind would be there.
Yeah. How are you two doing? You're looking like you're thinking really hard. Oh, okay. Uh-huh. All right. Oh, yes.
I was thinking about one reason that we bounce between nihilism and extreme and
Permanence or...
there's a line in my notes here, I think it's paraphrased. We have a hard time differentiating between the inherently existent object, which does exist, and the conventional object, which doesn't exist.
I think got that backwards. Yep. Phew.
Hard time differentiating between the inherently existent object, which doesn't exist, and the conventional object, which does exist, dependently anomalous. And so we have a hard time differentiating between these two selves.
Mm-hmm.
So when we hear that it doesn't, we don't pull them apart when they're inherently existent and one doesn't exist.
Yeah. In our mind, they come together. Even if we have like an eye consciousness looking at an object, right on that is and it appears truly existent. And there's a conventional consciousness, especially if we like it. Ooh, that's very nice. Ooh, I'd like to have that as my own. All of a sudden there's grasping at it. So those two things are mixed. They become very sticky. Yeah, it's understandable. And we've been doing it since the beginning of this time. So we're going to have to apply a bit of effort. Okay. Shall we go on to number 10? Oh, I'm sorry. Didn't see you.
I was just going to say that that's exactly what ultimate analysis is that you look at the mind that misapprehends the object, looks at the object, and grasps as an inherently existing self, And then the ultimate analysis says, okay, you've grasped at it, now go find it, see where it is, and then look at, is it in the aggregate? Is it outside of the aggregate? Is it in each part of the aggregate? Is it in each mental consciousness? And so by doing the ultimate analysis of each of these potentially different modes or places where you can find yourself and not find it, that's I think when you arrive at the conclusion, then that it does not exist in that way.
You know, she sits there so quietly, just soaking it all in. Yeah, that's very clear. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and if we think back to maybe a couple times ago, our conversation with Jeffrey, wondering, you know, at what point does the analysis actually stop and there's more of an experience? Do you remember that conversation that we were having? So a person is relying on, at that stage, or you know, at some stage, like within the conceptual stage, you're relying on your correct reasons. You know, it doesn't exist. The self doesn't exist inherently because it depends on causes and conditions. It depends on parts, more subtle. It depends on being labeled by mind. And you're thinking about, this is the way I understand it, you're thinking about that. And you know, when we do think about things, we do have these moments where the penny drops and we go, oh. You know, it's not like something changed externally, but some understanding, some insight developed. And imagine if you had the power of calm abiding and special insight also behind that kind of analysis. You know, at some point you would have an experience that you could just call on and dwell, you know, you could call it up more easily and just dwell on it and make it stronger and stronger and stronger without a lot of additional analysis. Sometime, some life. Okay, let's go on to number 10, because there's quite a bit to talk about there. Number 10 says, explain why the aggregates are not the self. They do not exist in the self. The self is not in the aggregates. The self cannot exist without the aggregates. The self and the aggregates are not mixed like fire and fuel. So this is really getting back to verse 82, that that's basically, she's quoting verse 82. The aggregates are not the self, nor do they exist in the self, nor is the self in the aggregates, but without them the self cannot exist. And the self and the aggregates are not mixed like fire and fuel. Therefore, how could the self exist? So Nagarjuna is saying that if the person existed inherently or truly, it would have to exist in relation to the aggregates in one of these 5 ways. Okay, so it's just interesting, this is just fun facts to know, that the Buddha actually talked about four of these negations in sutras. So the self is not inherently one with the aggregates. The self does not inherently possess the aggregates. Now that's not one of ours that we're looking at tonight, but the self is not inherently dependent on the aggregates. Aggregates are not inherently dependent on the self. So the Buddha spoke about these 4. Then Nagarjuna introduced, really it's like a summation of 3 and 4. He added the self is not inherently different from the aggregates. And that's actually what you would conclude looking at the self is not inherently dependent, the aggregate's not inherently dependent on the self. Okay, so he added that one. Now, an additional one we find here in Precious Garland that I hadn't seen before is that the self and the aggregates are not entirely mixed like fire and fuel. And it seems that that is coming from, I mean, Buddha didn't say anything extraneous. He only uttered things or talked about things, and I'm assuming that Nagarjuna is somehow gleaning this from the Buddhist teaching. So there must be some person or some groups of people or some tenet holders who are asserting a kind of self that is inexpressibly mixed, as it says further on, like fire and fuel. So we'll get to that. Then Chandrakirti, in his supplement to Nagarjuna's fundamental treatise or root of wisdom, he added that the self is not the shape of the aggregates, the self is not the collection of the aggregates. So there are many reasonings that we can use to refute inherent existence. In this verse, we can see hints of both the 4-point analysis, negating that the self is either inherently one or inherently different from the aggregates. We can also see the precursor to the sevenfold analysis that we talk about when we talk about the chariot. Okay, so I wanted to read something from Lamrim Chimmo, Volume 3. It's on page 290. This is a nice setup for this section. And it's specifically talking in relation to the position that the self is not inherently one with the aggregates. Okay, it says, in the general case, we see in the world that when a phenomena is mentally classified as accompanied, like goes together with something, it is precluded from being unaccompanied. Right? They're mutually exclusive. They're an eliminative pair. Okay, so, and when it's classified as unaccompanied, it is precluded from being accompanied. In general, therefore, same and different, or one and different, one and many, as well as single and plural, eliminate any further alternative because the unaccompanied and the accompanied are respectively single and plural. So when you resolve in general that something must be either one or not one, then you also resolve that for the particular case of what exists inherently, it says essentially, but it's talking about inherently, it must be either essentially one or essentially different. Inherently one or inherently different. So just as something is either going to be one or different, the same applies to inherently one or inherently different. Okay, so I hope that just helps us to see that. That's why with the 4-point analysis, the second step is understanding the pervasion. Okay, you understand the first step is the identifying the object of negation, and then the pervasion. It has to be, the labeled object has to be inherently one with its basis of designation, or inherently different, or many. It means the same thing, inherently distinct. So it's good that we understand what those terms mean. All right, so one, the definition of one is non-diverse phenomena. Cup is only one with cup, and there's only one cup. It's not like we have two cups and we're saying two cups are one, it's just cup is one. All right. It's the same in name, it's the same in meaning because there's only one. Now, different or distinct or many or plural, however you want to look at that, different, let's call it different, is diverse phenomena. Two things, now we're looking at two things that are not the same in both name and meaning. So we can have different kinds of two things that are different. We can have different in name, but not meaning, like car and automobile. They're the same in meaning, but they're different in name. Or product and impermanent, different in name, really same in meaning, although there's something to be understood by the different definitions of them. The mind apprehends them differently, but they're talking about impermanent phenomena, or impermanence. All right. Or, okay. So that's different in name, but not meaning. How about different in meaning, but not name? Yeah, mouse and mouse. Different in, it sounds the same, but it's not the same name, is it? Any homonym, right? Yeah, bat and bat. There's lots of different kinds of bats, aren't there? Okay. How about different in name and meaning? Pot and pillar is the traditional example. Pot and pillar are different in name and meaning. Any two things, right? Gong and clanker. All right, there's also one that's not usually mentioned, but things can be different but related. So it's not like they have to be completely unrelated. I mean, they can be mutually inclusive, like we saw with permanent and or impermanent and product. But they could be different but related, like the state and the country that state is in. They're different, but they are related, but they're still different. Okay, so that's one and different. Yeah.
So it could be two identical cups, but they're not the same cup. Is that true? There's two.
This cup and that cup are different. They're distinct.
Even if they remain the same, they look pretty much the same to us.
Yeah. Even if you say cup and cup, if you're referring to different things, well, that's a little bit tricky because cup is cup. But this cup and that cup, now they are distinct in name and meaning because you're meaning this cup, not that cup.
And they can't occupy the same space.
That's right. Yeah, that's a good point. They can't occupy the same space. Okay.
Cup and mug referring to the same cup are still different.
Yes. They're different in name. Yeah, so they're one entity, but different. Yeah, don't even say that word, isolates. Just say different. Okay, now let's talk about one entity and different entity, because this is different again. So it's good we understand these terms. One entity and different entity. Or, it's complicated. It's complicated. Yeah. Read about it in debate. Okay. Now again, these have different terms. We could say one nature, different natures, one essence, different essence. So there are different ways of translating these terms. One entity means that, so we're talking about two things. Two things that are one entity are those which appear to a reliable cognizer, but do not appear separately. They both appear, the two objects, those appear to a reliable cognizer or valid cognizer, and they do not appear separately. So for instance, Nancy and Venerable Simke appear as one to my mind. There's not two things appearing to one valid cognizer. Okay? That's right. Person and aggregate are one entity. Emptiness of cup and cup are one entity. You cannot, even though we can't see the emptiness of cup, it still is one entity with cup because it's a characteristic of cup, or the impermanence of cup. Yep. So we could make lots of examples like that. Also, this would include things that are essentially related. You know, there are two types of relation. There's causally related phenomena, like a sprout and a seed and a sprout. It sprout. Anything that's cause and effect. And then there's an essential relationship, like product and impermanent share an essential relationship. If you see one, you necessarily see the other. Okay, that works really neatly with impermanent and product, but there are also things that are essentially related, but one is a subset of the other. Like vase is inherently one, not inherently, essentially one, or wrong word, is one entity. Vase is one entity with the category impermanence, because if you didn't have the category of impermanence, you would not have a vase. But you can't say it the other way around. You can't say impermanence is one entity with vase, because even if you don't have a vase, you can still have impermanence, things that fit in the category, or the whole category of impermanence. Might sound technical, but okay. Yeah, if you can come up with it, I'll try to use it. Relationship of essence, relationship of intrinsic relationship. Those are the more common ones. Okay. So that fits in this category of one entity. I don't know. You tell me. All right, so that's one entity. Yeah.
So you're saying something could be a constituent of something else and be one entity with it?
Yeah, like
Something that's impermanent being one with impermanent phenomena?
Okay, like, yeah, like base and impermanence, the category. Base is a subset of the category of impermanence. Or we could say,
Pure can be two different things.
no.
One appears to be a small part of the other.
You can't see vase without seeing impermanence. Subtle impermanence actually appears to our mind, we just can't ascertain it. Isn't that interesting?
Just like looking at a brick, brick doesn't appear to be house, it appears to be a brick, part of the house. And a base doesn't appear to me to be the category of impermanence.
It will the more you study Dura.
Fit into that category and be much smaller than that category.
All right, let's think of something you can relate to then. Window and house. Window is one entity with house. Without the house, you won't have a house window. But house is not one entity with the house's window. Because you can still have a house even if the window, you've taken the window out to fix it.
Right, but I'm having trouble fitting that to your first definition.
Oh, okay. Well, okay, so if you look at the smaller thing, like if you look at the window, you do see the house, don't you? I mean, in theory, if we were standing back and we were looking at the house, you can't see house actually without looking at its parts, can you? It might seem as if we're looking at house, but actually to see house, we have to see the windows, the doors, the wood, the roof, you know, everything that makes up the house. We can't see house without seeing the parts. So it does work if you think of it that way. Okay. No, think about it. Okay, one.
What was your first definition of two things that
Yes, so one entity is described as those which appear to a valid cognizer or reliable cognizer and don't appear as separate. Yeah. So if I looked at house window, I would see
separate, not different?
separate. Yes. Yeah. In other words, I don't need to look with, you know, house window over here and house over here. See, even that window that's in your truck that's going into the house, that's not a house window yet. That's just a window. Hasn't become part of the house yet.
So is it like, you have a flower, a pink flower, and this flower, and then you have the color pink. So both of them are of the same entity, but it's actually two different.
They're distinct. They're one pink. Which way would it go? Pink. If we say the category of pink, and we have a pink flower, so the pink flower is one in essence with all the things that are in the pink category. But you can have a pink category even if you don't have a pink flower. Yeah.
When you're seeing the pink flower, you're seeing pink and you're seeing flower,
Yep.
but it's one object.
Well, you're seeing the pink flower.
But you're seeing
It's not like you're seeing pink over here and flower over here. You're seeing pink flower. We need to study Dura. Okay, so let's not get too bogged down here because we'll never get to the question. All right, so different entities. These are things that are unrelated. Different entities. Cup and ruler, different entities. Pillar and pot, different entities. Now, interestingly, seed and its sprout are different entities, aren't they? Can they exist at the same time? They can't. So they're different entities. Yeah, they're not causally related if they're existing at the same time. Okay, so different entities is two things that are unrelated.
So is causally related phenomena synonymous with different.
No. No, because cow and tiger are also different entities, but they're not causally related. Yes?
Or cannot exist at the same time part of the definition, or is that just applied to the example you gave?
It's just part of the property of things that are causally related. They don't exist at the same time. The cause ceases at the same time as the effect begins.
So then the two components of the definition is that they are unrelated and cannot exist at the same time.
Well, if two things are, oh, I see, I see. No, no. So these are two examples of things that are unrelated. One is a causal, things that are causally related, like say, seed and its sprout, but they don't exist at the same time. But you can have a cow and a tiger that exist at the same time, and those are different. So these are two different examples of things that are different entities. Yep, yep. Okay. Now the reason that we're belaboring this point is because we're trying to understand, what does inherently one mean? How can the self not be inherently one with the aggregates? We have to understand these terms. So inherently one, if things were inherently one, they would have to be completely and inseparably one, indistinguishable, identical. That's right. If we say something about one, it's also true of the other. So this is the first example that we're going to look at. You know, is the self inherently one with the aggregates? Okay, so this is inherently one is different than one, and it's different than one entity. It has unique characteristics. But inherently one and inherently different are also, well, actually, I won't say that yet. Okay, let's talk about inherently different. Completely unrelated, like hot and cold. Now, hot and cold may seem related, but they're relative, but they're not related. They're not causally related, they're not intrinsically related. Hot does not cause cold, and you can get rid of hot and not necessarily have cold. You could have room temperature. Yep. Mutually dependent is a little bit tricky. Actually, okay, if you had to debate that, you would say they fall into being intrinsically related. Why? Because they're not causally related. It's not necessarily that they fit the definition of being intrinsically related, but where else do you put them? Because from the point of view of philosophy, you'd say there are these two types of relationship. But you're right. There is dependently related, like this side of the mountain, and the far side of the mountain. Yeah. Let's save that. All right. So the first line in verse 82 says the aggregates are not the self. All right. So we have to understand what's really being said here. If we were to spell this out, it really means that the aggregates are not inherently one with the self. Or the aggregates are not identical with the self. Intellectually, that's not too terribly difficult, but in the spur of the moment, sure seems like they're fused. All right. So the person and the aggregates are one entity, or one nature, but they are not inherently one nature. So if they were inherently one nature, one entity, they would have to be identical. The I and the aggregates would be inseparably one, exactly the same in every way. Why is that the case?
Because they would be inherently the same.
Yes. And that implies that they can't depend on each other. Because dependence and inherent existence are opposites. Mutually exclusive. Contradictory. Okay, so if we talk about two things being inherently one, they have to be inseparably one, totally identical. So if the aggregates and the person were inherently one, then there would be many consequences to this. Maybe you remember some of them. Do you?
Well, yeah, I mean, they're all quite ridiculous, right? The one about how there would be 5 cells.
Yes, because there are 5 aggregates, there would be 5 selves, or because there's one self, there would be one aggregate. Yep. Anything else? When the body stops, the person would stop and wouldn't go to future lives. And so karma would go to waste. We can't have that happening. What else? Yes?
If the self were inherently one with the aggregates, each aggregate would have to be inherently one with the other aggregates.
Yeah, I think you're right. So the body would have to think, and the mind would have to walk. Yeah. or get hungry. We have enough hunger already. Yes,
There's no need to serve an I.
right. Because, yeah, yeah. Right. So every time you would say I, you could say body. My body got a new job today. Yeah, my body wouldn't make any sense. Body got a job today. Body did its work, did the chores today.
Person in one moment, but those inherently, that aggregates would be totally different than the next. There would be no relationship between the continuity of the.
That's right. There'd be no continuity between a prior moment and a later moment, and so it would be ridiculous to talk about, it'd be untenable to talk about past lives or future lives. We couldn't remember anything. Yeah. Okay.
And wouldn't experience the results of our karma. That might be a benefit. Exactement.
Oh,
Yeah, we could never become awake.
that's a horrible consequence. Yeah, that's a consequence. We could never become awakened. Okay. The I would become form and would be observable like a watch. We say, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I'm cold, but if the I and the 5 aggregates were inherently one, then we could say that the mind was cold, thirsty, hungry, and so on. The 5 aggregates of body and mind would continue to the next rebirth together. For instance, if the person were inherently one with the aggregates, a person took rebirth in a mother's womb, then the present life aggregates and body and mind would necessarily be reborn there. Hello. Yeah. Okay, so there's lots of ridiculous consequences, but what's important is that we go over them again and again to really get the conclusion that we're aiming for, which is the self is not inherently one with the aggregates. Okay, then in this formulation, the next one that Nagarjuna puts forward is the aggregates are not in the self. So I think an easier way of understanding this is that the aggregates are not inherently dependent on the self. And then the third one is the self is not inherently dependent on the aggregates or in the aggregates. Okay. So in general, the aggregates and the self have a relationship of one is the basis. You know, the aggregates are the basis, and the person is dependent. We see that in the definition. It's dependently imputed on that basis. So there is this dependent relationship. However, they're not inherently basis independent. Right? So the aggregates are not in the self, or the aggregates do not inherently depend on the self. That is to say that the aggregates, for example, the example given is a bowl of yogurt is like the basis, so like the aggregates, and then the yogurt is the dependent or the supported, like the self. So it would be like the aggregates are existing and the self resides somewhere within the aggregates, as if they're different, as if they're distinct. All right, so these fall under refuting inherently different. Or if in the next line the I is not in the aggregates, the I or the self does not inherently depend on the aggregates. Here the aggregates would be like a house, and the I would be independent but in the house. The self is not inherently in the aggregates. Oh, number 2, the aggregates are not in the self. Is that right? Did I get it right? The aggregates are not in the self. The bowl is the basis. Okay, I think it's backwards than how, in general, we would say the I is the dependent, and the aggregates are the basis or the support. But if we have this inherent aspect, let's see, I think it gets flipped there. So the bowl is the basis, or the self is the basis in that example if it's inherently dependent. If the aggregates are not in the self or inherently dependent on the self. Yeah, so it's a little tricky that way. It helps to just write out very clearly, in general, this is how it exists. In this example, it would exist this way. It would be back to front. Okay. So if we were making a chart, and I think this is a good idea, to make a chart, on one side you have refuting inherently one, and on the other side you have refuting inherently different. And then see where each of these 5 fit. Actually, there's 6, or at least we'll come to that. Okay, so we've refuted inherently one. Self is not inherently one with the aggregates. And we've begun refuting inherently different because we've looked at the self is not inherently different from the aggregates. That falls in the other category. And self does not inherently depend on and the aggregates, self does not inherently depend. Oh, did I skip one? Sorry, I've confused myself. Let me look at the verse. Aggregates are not the self. They do not exist in the self. The self is not in the aggregates. Okay, that's all right. Then the next one is the self cannot exist without the aggregates. 4. Okay. Without them, the self cannot exist. This is actually getting at the self is not inherently different from the aggregates. So it's maybe like a summary, or it's the larger category of the last 2 that we just looked at. Without the aggregates, there wouldn't be a person. It's impossible to identify the person without the presence of the aggregates. The person can't exist on its own, independent of the aggregates. So here again, there are a number of very absurd consequences to assert that without the aggregates, the self can exist inherently. See, this wording is a little bit tricky, but really what it's getting at is the self is not inherently different from the aggregates. All right, so what are some of the absurd consequences with this one? Mm-hmm.
If the person aggregates were inherently different, you could start taking each of the aggregates away one at a time, and in the end you'd still have a person.
Yes. Right, so taking the aggregates away one by one, you'd still have a person. Yeah, wouldn't that be convenient? The aggregates could be one place and the person could be another place. Yes, yes. They're still one entity. The self wouldn't have any mental or physical properties because you've taken away the aggregates? Uh-huh. Okay. Yeah. That would be awkward. Okay, anything?
The self will continue, and when the aggregates die, the self will continue. They are different.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay.
Well, with rebirth, there would be the concept that it does happen, that the self continues when the aggregates come apart.
But it's not completely separate from the aggregates, is it? Because it's mind that goes on. The self is never completely separate from the aggregates. We do separate from the coarse aggregates, the coarse body, the coarse minds. But there's also always a subtle mind. Yep.
There's no self in the subtle mind, it's only the mirror eye. That's the one that sees us.
But now it sounds like you're saying the person is the mere label. There's nothing other than the mere label.
No, I'm saying that whatever goes from one life to the next is not the self, it's just a mere eye.
Well, I is synonymous with self, so the mere self goes from life to life.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. I, self, person, being, those are all synonymous terms.
So I'm not going to ask my next question because I'm going
Okay. All right. Now, number 5, the self and the aggregates are not mixed like fire and fuel. So evidently some people believe the person and the aggregates have an inexpressible relationship that is neither one nor different. They believe the person and the aggregates are mixed in an ineffable, inexpressible fashion like wood and fire burning it. So who asserts such a thing? I would like to know. Perhaps it's the Vatsiputrians or the Samitya. They're a subset of the Samityas in the Great Exposition system. Don't know. So when wood is burning, the fire is inseparable from it. That's how it's considered. The fire is, they're one entity. One entity, yet distinct, aren't they? Okay, so actually, in fact, it's the fuel becomes the fire. So I think they're making a distinction, as I recall. Wood does become the fuel, but usually they talk about the fuel being kindling. I'm probably just confusing you. Anyway, let's say the wood is burning. When wood is burning, the fire is inseparable from it. The fuel or the wood becomes the fire. Does wood become fire? It's awkward to say that, isn't it? How can wood burn if it's the fire? Isn't the wood burning? It's tricky. Okay, so this is the problem, is that these people are saying that the aggregates and the person are mixed in this ineffable, inexpressible fashion that we can't comprehend. So we just have to accept that's their assertion and what to do. Okay, anyway, Nagarjuna refutes that, says that's not how it is. Okay. Now, in place of the 5th point in the fundamental wisdom, or the root of wisdom, fundamental treatise, many names, Nagarjuna says that the person does not inherently possess the aggregates. And this one is interesting because it can fall either in refuting inherently one or refuting inherently other. So the examples typically given is that the self and the aggregate do not have a relationship like Devadatta possessing his nose inherently. Okay, so Devadatta and his nose are one entity, or Devadatta's nose and Devadatta are one entity. We'd have to say it that way. But they're not inherently one entity. For all the reasons that we've already said about the self and the aggregates not being inherently one. And Devadatta does not possess his aggregates like he possesses a cow, for all the reasons that we've just said, two things being inherently different. So while the prior ones all fit neatly underneath one or the other, this one about the person does not inherently possess the aggregates can be found under both, because there are these different examples that can be used. Okay, so after all this analysis, there's only one viable conclusion to reach. What is it? Have you reached it? Actually, we can learn the words and we can repeat the words and we can spout the words, but the real benefit of this kind of exercise is to think about it again and again, obviously, and to begin to get some feeling, like you were talking about, Venerable Simke, to get some feeling about how absurd, and like you said, how absurd these are. But we can actually apply that absurdness when we find ourselves thinking along the lines of the self and the aggregates being one. Any questions? I'm particularly looking at these two. How you going over there? All right. Like I said, September 24th and October 1st, October 8th, there's some really good teachings on these that may be a little more accessible for people new to the topic. Stephen?
Did you say that something inherently existed, it would necessarily not be impeded by mind?
Yes, because it can't depend on anything. So for instance, like, a child, when a child comes into the world, you wouldn't have to name it Stephen. You would just go, look, there's Stephen. Because it can't depend on anything. This is the thing that we really need to think about. Can't depend on anything. Actually, could we even know something that inherently existed? This kind of bothers me sometimes. Maybe there's something that inherently exists that I just can't know, because then it would depend on me knowing it. You couldn't. You couldn't. Nothing can know it inherently. Maybe it's like black holes, no one can know it. No, I mean, it doesn't, according to logic, it doesn't stand to reason that there's anything that inherently exists. Because if something isn't existent, it has to be known by some type of awareness. That's the definition of awareness in this, or, known by a valid cognizer. Shall we leave it there? Is that okay?
So, then we'll have 6 and 7.
Oh, okay. Right. So Chandrakirti added 2 more. He talked about the self is not the shape of the aggregates and not the collection of the aggregates. The arrangement. Okay, the shape. Yeah. And we studied those extensively in the middle way studies. They're actually quite difficult to really grab onto. They're very extensive explanations there. So have a look in volume 3 of Lamrim Chenmo or Emptiness Yoga. Okay, good. Yeah. What I recall is that both of them depend on drawing out really subtle aspects of other schools' assertions and then turning those against them. So.
What Kishidato said about not being independent, not being the collection,
Mhm.
that if you think about a collection, think about it, well, it's very obviously dependent. You can take one thing away and it's not the same collection anymore.
Uh-huh.
An arrangement would be the same thing.
Yes.
For a collection or an arrangement can't be inherently existent.
Right. So like a mala is a good example, isn't it? A mala is only a mala in dependence upon a certain number of beads being strung together. You don't have a mala if you don't have this dependent relationship. Yeah, so I think there are 2 ways of understanding or coming to an understanding about the self not being the collection of the aggregates. One of them doesn't even depend on inherent existence. You can just observe from your own experience that things that are a collection are naturally independent. But my recollection is there's another way to refute that. Yeah. Yes.
One of the notes I've got from one of my books is that by discerning and seeking the basis of designation of the names of the subjective self and of all that appears as objects to this self, such as the 5 aspects and the 5 sensory objects that seem to be mine, decisively recognise them as objects with emptiness, since all names are nothing more than interdependent imputations, and their basis of designation are not established as inherently real.
Well said. What do you say to that? Yeah, good. You're on the right page.